Something is living in my Christmas tree. Written and narrated by Remy Militello. Before we begin tonight's story, I just wanted to issue a quick trigger warning. There is implied and explicit violence against animals in this story, so if you are not willing or able to handle those topics, it would probably be best for you to skip this story and join us again next week. Without further ado, here's our story. Liam stared up into the brooding green triangle that towered before him. He had been instructed by his father, Eduardo, though he went by Ed, to water the base of the Christmas tree, the same task Liam had done for the past 7 years. It had been his job since he could be trusted to hold the can without spilling it on the presents or ornaments. His sister, Olivia, was still too young at 5 to not do exactly that. Therefore, the duty remained his. Ordinarily, he didn't mind, but this year was different, because this year's tree was not like the others. Churro, the Santiago family's fat orange tabby, had noticed it as well. Typically, they wouldn't be able to keep the cat out of the Christmas tree. The fluffy tomcat considered it essentially his own personal giant glimmering toy. Liam had found him tangled up in its branches and tinsel in past years more than once. Last holiday, he had even brought the whole tree crashing down on top of him. No matter how many times Ed shouted at "that damn cat," he couldn't be persuaded otherwise. But not this year. Churro watched the tree suspiciously, with knife-point slits out of golden eyes. Occasionally, his fur would stand on edge, and his tail would expand like electricity was running through it. Before he hissed and darted back into a dark corner to sulk. Max, their mutt that had a fair amount of pit bull and what they thought might be poodle, also wouldn't go anywhere near the intimidating pine. The day Ed and Liam had come home from the forest with it, Max had sniffed at it gingerly, growled, and then ran upstairs to take refuge under Olivia's bed. Liam hadn't even been able to lure him out with milk bones that night so that he could do his business. Instead, opting to do it on the kitchen floor in the twilight before dawn. In the forest, it had been a beautiful tree. Tall and proud, green fingers reaching out in all directions. Ed had been enormously pleased with himself for finding the tree for free, boasting loudly to his son about how smart they were for not paying those swindlers down at the tree farm. The woods had been at the end of an old dirt path that ran near the bar he tended. The road hadn't been labeled and wasn't on any map that Ed could find. The freshly fallen snow also made the path nearly invisible, but he hadn't let that deter him. As he saw it, the clever fox got the hen. If he was smart enough to find the road, he should use it to the fullest. Slight regret dug into Ed as he drove his rusty pickup into the thick, shadowy place. He reassured his son and himself that he had nothing to fear out there. Nothing more than maybe some whitetail or an ornery skunk. Even though they had driven out there at midday, the path had been gloomy, like the sun wouldn't or couldn't penetrate that deeply into the thicket of sprawling pines. The road terminated at a dilapidated cabin in the woods. Outside was a car with rotten tires and a bonnet eaten through completely by rust. The windows in the truck and cabin were broken in, like teeth knocked out of a decrepit skull. Ed reckoned whoever lived here didn't anymore, and hadn't for a long time. The land smelled earthy and alive with things Liam had never encountered before. Things he would go on just fine never meeting face to face with. Much to his father's chagrin, Liam enjoyed the comforts of worn pages and lit screens more than dirt and rock. The wilderness held little appeal. It only lit a flame of fear within him of what might be lurking out there. Liam had been worried about running into a Wendigo or a skinwalker out there that day, like the ones he had read about online. But Ed told him that they didn't believe in those boogeymen and to grow up. The tree had towered only a few feet away from the emaciated old truck and pile of cabin-shaped timbers. Ed proclaimed the tree was perfect, and after he finished his smoke, they would set to work chopping the gorgeous thing down. Ed had insisted that his son start the process, that he was old enough to use the axe, and that it would help toughen him up, the offer punctuated by a playful punch to Liam's shoulder, the kind the boy hated. Ed held out the grooved and polished handle to his boy. The silvery head of the blade looked intimidating and lethal to Liam. It felt like his father was trying to hand him a viper that he was holding by the neck. Liam took it. The tool was heavier than he expected. It was difficult for him to hold it without his shoulders bowing in. The axe felt dangerous in his hands, and he didn't like the feeling. He trudged over to the tree, his boots digging deep into the fallen snow. His father cracked open the tab on a can of beer and shouted encouragements to his boy. He told him to stay away from the sharp end, which seemed sufficient safety instructions. Liam did his best to swing the axe as hard as he could into the base of the beastly pine. Thwack! The blade cracked against the tree. The impact stuck the axe head into the bark, and the shock reverberated back through the handle and jolted up the boy's stick arms. The knock hurt. He hadn't been expecting that. He tried to pull out the blade to go again. His shoulders and biceps instantly began to burn from exertion. He couldn't get it out. His face began to flush from embarrassment. Liam put his boot heel against the base of the tree and began to pull with all his young body's might. Suddenly it came loose, but once more Liam had not been expecting it. The inertia of the pull ripped the handle right out of his hand and sent the axe flying from him. A yelp escaped his lips, but that was all he managed. The axe went tumbling into a snowbank beyond. All he could hear was his father laughing, and all he could feel was shame. The boy slowly retrieved the axe, digging into the hole in the snow. Finally, he found it again and walked over to his father, defeated. Without another word, Ed traded his son the axe for the beer, and they spoke no more of it. Liam held his father's beer and kept a lookout for anyone who looked like they might own the land. This was something he could do well. At first it was deathly silent, aside from the thumps against the tree, but then he caught something strange in the air. The boy told his father that he heard something that sounded like hissing and then clicking. He couldn't be sure, but it sounded like it was coming from the stately pine before them. His father waved it off like a cloud of tobacco smoke, telling him with a grin it was probably just a feral cat trying his luck at some woodpeckers. As Ed hacked away at the tree, the joke reminded Liam that there was actually no birdsong at all. Now that he noticed it, there was no sound of any wildlife whatsoever. Only the steady rhythm of his father's axe's whack could be heard, until finally the pine groaned and its base buckled from the pressure of being sliced at its base. Timber! That had been 2 days ago. Olivia had been excited about the tree when Liam and her father came bustling into their small house, knocking off the snow that they had collected on their clothes with great big stomps. The giant plant had seemed larger than life to the little girl, and meant that presents would soon be coming. Yesterday, Olivia and her abuela had been decorating the tree, just like the little girl used to with her mother, but now that she was gone, it fell to the child and her abuela to make sure the tree looked right for dear old Papa Noel. The pair had been doing a splendid job of it as well. They were nearly finished hanging the lights when Olivia fell backward off the chair she had been standing on. She screamed as she tottered backward, taking the chair with her. Liam had been reading on the floor behind them. He hardly had time to look up before he felt his baby sister slam into his back. He swore from the pain. Olivia began to bawl uncontrollably, and their abuela scolded Liam for cursing before sweeping up the weeping girl in her arms. She asked the child what was wrong and why she had fallen so suddenly. Between fits of tears and wailing, she cried, "I saw something moving in the tree." Liam said nothing and rubbed his aching back. It's just your imagination, little one. The old woman cooed and planted a kiss on her granddaughter's forehead. But Olivia was certain that the branches had moved. Her brother looked into the dark recesses of the tree, but didn't see anything. He gave his sister a hug and told her she probably shook the branch when she was hanging the lights. She gave him a doubtful look and a teary pout, but their father came in to tell them to wash up for dinner, and that was all that was said of the incident. Since then, Olivia wouldn't go near the tree. Now it was Liam who stood alone in front of the towering pine, watering can in hand and a fist-sized rock in his stomach. He moved in slowly, like the tree was a wild animal that might lash out if he made any sudden movements. Carefully, he bent down and reached out to pour the water into the red and green metal base. With a slight splash, the water raced out of the can. Liam looked up just in time to see the branches just above his face begin to rustle. The boy swallowed a cry of surprise as he fell backward onto his butt, dropping the can and pouring the contents all over the carpet. He scooted back like a dog until his back hit the couch. His eyes never left the tree. That was until he felt a sharp pain in his wrist. He yelled and raised the can to strike whatever had attacked him. He turned and saw Churro under the couch, ears back and hissing at him. He had apparently blown his own hiding spot from the terrifying tree. Liam? The boy jumped again as he turned to face his little sister. Olivia, he sputtered as if he had just been caught doing something wrong. Is it time yet? She asked excitedly. He stared at her in bewilderment, his pulse finally slowing down. Time for what? For today's presents! It was then that it struck him what she wanted. The advent calendars. She wanted her daily reward of candy. It was a ritual she took the utmost delight in. Their father had gotten them both one of their own, large cardboard affairs that had printed pictures of Santa's workshop on it, with the final day leading up to the big man's sleigh. Yeah, it's time, he said shakily. She jumped with joy and skipped upstairs to their shared bedroom. The upstairs consisted of only 3 rooms and a tiny hall that connected them all together. Liam smiled, momentarily forgetting about the tree, and followed his sister upstairs. They passed their father's empty room as he was bartending until deep into the night. Liam looked into his abuela's room to see her where she normally was, sleeping on her plush chair, watching soap operas. He walked into the room he shared with his sister to find her and Max dancing around the room. She had already taken out her piece of chocolate and was humming a made-up tune while Max begged for a taste. Liam smiled and picked up his own calendar off the dresser. He looked at all of the open little compartments, a reminder of how close they were to the big day. His fingers found the little doors with a 22 printed on them in bold white numbers. He popped them open and picked out the piece of chocolate with foil to make it look like a present. That night, Liam awoke into darkness. He wasn't sure why, but he sensed something was happening. He looked over at their digital clock and it read 4:23. Even his father would be back by now, and likely firmly asleep. The boy listened. He heard Max snoring across the room on Olivia's bed, but nothing else. Then, a moment later, he heard a sound like something breaking, followed by the patter of many tiny feet running around downstairs. Finally, there was another crash, a hiss, then a pained yowl, and then silence. The whole incident took place over less than 30 seconds, but somehow it made Liam feel deeply uneasy as he remembered the motion in the tree. He told himself it was just Churro being a stupid cat, and he would see in the morning that it was nothing at all. Liam pulled the covers over his head. Nothing at all, he murmured. The next morning came, and Liam was woken up to his father loudly yelling. He threw his comforter off and tiptoed to the stairs to see what was going on. Olivia was crying. Liam hadn't been quiet enough because his father's eagle eye caught him at the top of the stairs. "Get down here and help me clean this up. That damn cat of yours broke your mother's vase." Liam didn't say a word. He simply obeyed and got the broom and dustpan from the cupboard. Olivia materialized behind him, her eyes still dewy with tears. "I can't find Churro," she said through sobs. "Good. I'll strangle that mangy furball if I see him again." Liam didn't say anything, but he could see tears in the bends of his father's eyes as well. The vase had meant a lot to Mom, and so it had meant a lot to Ed. It tore up Liam's heart to sweep up the shattered pieces. The whole end table had been knocked over. It clicked in the boy's mind that this must have been the commotion he had heard last night. A sinking dread sat inside of him. He wanted to find their cat. He had wished he had gotten up last night to see what had happened. Liam and Olivia looked all morning for Churro, but they found neither hide nor hair of the orange tomcat. He was not under any bed, inside any closet, or on top of any cupboard. Olivia was beside herself after they had searched all of Churro's normal cat sanctuaries. Finally, they retired to the couch to get their minds off of it. Ed snoozed on a recliner next to him in preparation of his late shift that evening. Olivia had asked Liam to put on The Grinch for the 30th time this year, and like a dutiful older brother, he complied. The afternoon winded down in this way, with cartoons drowning out the children's sorrow. Max had put his big head on Olivia's little knees and looked up at her dolefully with his big brown eyes, as her own watched the television. Liam read his book, a sci-fi tale about time-traveling pirates fighting Vikings from space, until his eyes grew tired and put it down. It was then that the boy noticed something the pair had missed during their detective work earlier. He saw the glimmer of Churro's name tag and the bell that sat under it. The little leather strap sewn onto the tag was dangling on the lowest branch of the Christmas tree, like the cat had hung it up as an ornament. Curious, Liam stood up and slowly approached the foreboding branches. The tree was one of the only spots they hadn't checked. Neither of them had wanted to go anywhere near it, but Churro had hidden in their past trees. It was possible that the fluffy nuisance had simply climbed into the tree for a nap. Perhaps Liam would simply peel back the branches and find him precariously curled in the center. Then he could be a hero to his little sister and slay any lingering fears about this stupid tree. As he stepped closer, the television boomed a song about the green rapscallion stealing Christmas, and his father's snoring played as chorus. He noticed the tree still smelled strange, not just the normal and pleasant aroma of pine, but an undercurrent of something rich and earthy. With a palsied hand, Liam reached out to grab the nearest branch. He tore it back like a piece of stripping paint. There was no orange cat nestled snugly within. Instead, he saw a smattering of dark brown stains running along the tree's interior. Confused, he fingered the nearest branch with the substance on it. It was sticky, and it flaked onto his hand like dried chocolate. The strange stuff smelled of iron and made his arms break out in goose flesh. At first, Liam didn't hear the clicking over the din of the family room. A gasp escaped his lips after being startled by what sounded like a serpent's hiss. The guts of the pine began to twist and writhe. Liam tried to scream, but the cry got caught in his throat. A piece of dread too big to spit out now lodged there. It looked as if the insides of the pine had come to life. The hissing grew louder. Then two of the branches nearest to his face began to move. They twitched and swirled searchingly in the air. The branches were thick and furry, looking almost like natural pipe cleaners. Liam instinctively stepped back, dropping the tree limb he had been holding. It swung back into place, covering the two fuzzy tendrils inside the tree's depths again. The back of his foot hit his ankle, and before he could stop his momentum, he tripped over his own feet. With a crash that shook the room, his whole body slammed hard into the wooden floor. He thought bitterly that he just couldn't stay on his feet. The shock of the fall knocked the collar off of the tree and clattered to the ground. It also abruptly pulled Ed from the void of sleep. Thinking their home was being broken into again, he got to his feet in a daze and yelled, "Get out! I have a gun!" But as he realized it was only his clumsy son, his heartbeat slowed. "Oh, God, boy, you scared the shit out of me," he said with a smile. "Do we really have a gun?" asked his sister's tiny, sleepy voice. "No, but burglars don't know that." "Dad!" Liam shouted as he scrambled to his feet. His father wore an expression of perplexion. He could see the terror in his son's wide hazel eyes. "I know what happened to Churro." "Okay, shoot," his father shrugged. "The tree got him. I think it ate him." His father's face screwed up into a look of disbelief, the kind that children received when they told their parents they had seen Papa Noel go up the chimney, or Bigfoot in the backyard. "Look!" Liam scooped up the leather collar that had fallen to the ground and handed it to his father. Ed took it solemnly, his expression softening. There was a stain on it. He held the collar up to his face to make out what it was. Then he knew. "Mierda! This is blood!" Abuela Maria's croaky voice came from the kitchen to scold Ed to not swear. He looked annoyed, but shouted back his apology. "See, I told you, the tree ate Churro." Liam stated this fact plainly, as if it were obvious, then punctuated it by crossing his thin arms. "Churro's been eaten?" Olivia chimed in fearfully. Ed frowned, not knowing what to say to his daughter. He gritted his teeth as the wheels in his head turned. Clearly, the tree didn't kill their cat. He eyed Max, who was currently tearing up one of the tug-of-war ropes he destroyed regularly. Trees don't eat cats, but dogs, he knew they certainly could. Max had already gotten written up by the cops for biting a Jehovah's Witness. Even though he had never been overly aggressive toward the cat, he supposed that anything was possible. Certainly more plausible than the tree. Where was Max last night? Liam's face contorted into an expression of horror. Olivia didn't understand what was happening. "He was with me last night," she said helpfully. "All night?" Ed asked inquisitively. "Dad, it wasn't Max," Liam implored. "Well, it sure wasn't a tree, son." Ed stalked over to the pine and grabbed one of the branches and wiggled it. "Are you alive, Mr. Christmas Tree?" he asked mockingly. Olivia giggled. "No, I'm just a big potted plant," Ed said in the same voice he talked to them in as babies. Olivia clapped and begged him to do it again, but Liam was not amused. "I'm telling you, Dad, it wasn't Max." Liam pouted. "Well, either way, Max is sleeping downstairs tonight until I'm certain what happened." "No!" Olivia squealed. Only then did Max break his concentration on his task of ripping up rope. His head lifted with a tilt of confusion. Then he began to pant obliviously before whipping his rope back and forth. "I know you love Max, but he could fit your little head in his big mouth." Ed pretended his fingers were teeth and chomped down on her head before rustling her hazel hair. "But Dad," she whined. "But Dad," Ed mocked back in a falsetto. "No buts. Max stays down here tonight. Now both of you go wash up for dinner." The two dutifully did what they were told, and somberly went to the sink. Their abuela was humming along with the radio as she put plates out. Max followed at Ed's heels to get into the kitchen, but was blocked by the baby gate. The dog let out a low whimper and sat thumping his tail as the family ate in silence. Afterward, Ed left for his shift, but not before reiterating that Max was forbidden from sleeping upstairs. Olivia hugged Max with the tightest grip her little arms could muster. Liam did the same and whispered into the dog's ear to watch out and stay away from the tree. Liam and Olivia trudged up the stairs feeling defeated. Their room felt barren without Max's energy and sloppy kisses. They both joylessly went to their advent calendars and popped open the doors that had the number 23. This time it was a foil Santa. The crumbly dark sweetness brought little solace to either of them. "Do you think Max will be okay?" Olivia asked, getting into bed. Liam didn't answer at first. "I just hope he stays away from the tree," he said dejectedly. Liam left their room and walked to the top of the stairs. At the base was Max, blocked off by the treacherous baby gate. Abuela called to him that the dog stays downstairs. Liam didn't respond, but he could feel the tears coming up and his throat closed tight. "I'm sorry, boy," he murmured before heading back into his room and closing the door. It was nearly 5 a.m. when Liam's eyes slowly slid open. The neon green numbers on his alarm cut through the darkness to inform him of this. He wanted to just pull the covers up and turn over, but there was a strong sense of unease in him, like he had swallowed a spider and it was walking around inside of his gut. He looked over at his sister. Olivia was still sleeping, albeit not well. She had kicked her comforter down to the bottom of her bed. A whine floated through the air and it pierced his heart. It was then Liam heard a sound that made him sit up like a zombie from the grave. The gummy twilight of sleep was still addling his brain. It took him a moment to place it, but then another cry came followed by a whimper. Max. It had to have been. Liam threw his comforter off and placed his bare feet on the cold floor. He had been ignorant of what terrors befell poor Churro, but he couldn't stand by while his dog was being attacked. He thought of waking Olivia, or maybe even his dad, but one would be a liability, and the other would likely just tell him to go back to sleep. He bent down and searched under his bed for a weapon. After a moment of blind groping, his fingers brushed against the polished wood he sought. The baseball bat that Ed had bought him, and that he had never used, but he hoped it would prove to be good enough as an evil Christmas tree repellent. The floorboards creaked under him as he tiptoed to the door. Each wooden squeal made his heart jump, expecting his father to burst in at any moment and tell him off for being so ridiculous, but that didn't happen. Instead, he walked into the hall to hear his dad's thunderous snoring. Even with the door shut, he could still hear it. That meant he was sleeping the sleep of the dead, and he wouldn't need to worry about getting caught. Except by maybe Abuela, but outside of her uncanny ability to sense swearing, Liam knew she was practically deaf. A pained whimper ripped through the night once again. Liam began to feel sweat soaking through the pits of his pajamas. He grew more fearful with every step toward the stairs, but he needed to be strong. For Max. He reached the top of the stairs, but unfortunately the only light switch was at the bottom. Liam took the steps slowly. He didn't want whatever was down there to know he was there. When he was midway down, a malevolent stink hit him. Something akin to wet dog, and a scent that was metallic mixed with an earthy musk. It was a powerful and unpleasant smell. If he did not need both of his trembling hands on the bat, he would have used one to cover his nose. A strangled bark hit him like a bullet. Then another sound lashed out at him. The worst sound he had ever heard, a wet crunching that sounded like meat being torn apart by 1,000 tiny needles. The noise bore into him as if it were an automatic drill. It filled him with a primal fear. It was the terror of prey that thought they were the predator. Finally, he hit the bottom of the stairs. Despite his distrust of the dark, he knew he would not like what came in the light, but he flicked the switch anyway, and the soft yellow bulbs flared into existence. Liam wanted to scream. He wanted to rush forward and drive the bat down as hard as he could. The boy wanted to save his dog, but he was only able to freeze in place and gawk in fear at the sight before him. A long, furry, segmented body was extended out from inside the tree. Legs that looked like black talons chained together stuck out in their hundreds from the muscular appendage. The end of the tubular monstrosity was topped with two gigantic pincers, each the size of Liam's forearm. They were the gates to a ravenous black throat, lined with thousands of moving needles. The gigantic teeth had skewered poor Max through the chest, puncturing his lungs and making it impossible for him to truly cry for help. The dog's sad, watery eyes met with his master's, and he gave out a dry bark and a slight whimper. His entire body was entwined in a python's embrace. The muscular atrocity squeezed and squeezed around the dog. Liam could hear his dog's bones snap and break under the intense pressure, until finally the light left his companion's eyes. Only then did the green fiend release its deathly embrace. Then it began to devour Max piece by piece. The pincers ripped off chunks, and the tiny needles urged the meat into the rest of the awful creature's body. Tears began to roll silently down Liam's face. His father had been right. It wasn't the tree, it was something much worse. He could watch the gruesome spectacle no more. He dropped the bat and ran back up the stairs as fast as he could, away from the nightmare that lived in their tree and had invaded their home, right back into his bed where he wept. He did not sleep the rest of the night. All he was able to do was shake and watch his lockless door to make sure the creature did not come for him next. It was almost 8 in the morning when their abuela opened the door and announced breakfast was ready. Liam whispered a barely coherent thank you. Olivia groaned that she needed more sleep. Abuela clucked her tongue and told them to be at the table in 5 minutes. Olivia was yawning and relaying a dream to her brother about her riding a dragon to France. Liam murmured half-hearted affirmations, but he was exhausted and half delirious with what he had seen the previous night. When they hit the bottom of the stairs, the boy expected to see a great pool of blood, but there was no such puddle, just what appeared to be patches of crusty brown flakes, like the abomination that had eaten their pets had somehow cleaned up the scene of its hunt. A grimace was etched onto Liam's face. He had hoped the scene of the crime would have been all the proof he would need to show his father. But the idea evaporated like flesh and fire. His heart sank with charred hope. The defeat inside of his young mind felt total as he slipped into the kitchen chair. He sat down to a giant plate of tamales, fresh and hot. The steam was still cascading off of them. Liam sighed. He hated tamales. They tasted like mealy cardboard with pork. To top it off, they had a cornskin wrapper he absolutely despised the texture of. But this was a season of disappointment. He didn't think breakfast on Christmas Eve would be any different. Ed had already piled 2 of them onto his plate as he poured a scalding cup of black coffee. His eyes were bleary and looked red and rough. Liam wasn't sure if his dad had just drunk too much or had been up crying again. Perhaps both. Either way, he averted his gaze and pretended not to notice. Olivia squealed with delight. She loved tamales. She peeled back the husks with joy and blew on the molten innards. The little girl did a little dance in her chair before looking around for Max, with whom she normally shared bits of her breakfast surreptitiously under the table. The boy just stared at his empty plate, memories of last night robbing his appetite from him. It was then his abuela tousled his hair and told him good morning. She lifted a skillet off of the stove and proceeded to scoop 3 crispy slices of bacon and a mound of scrambled eggs onto his plate. Feliz Navidad. His abuela smiled down at him. Liam turned and gave her a giant hug. If happiness and comfort could take physical form, it would be bacon in this embrace. Always the picky eater, Ed chuckled. He took a massive bite of a tamale, smiling at his son with a full mouth. Abuela sat down with a cup of coffee and just enjoyed the company of her family. For the next 15 minutes, all was right in the Santiago household. It wasn't until the bacon was gone and Ed was on his 3rd cup of inky brew that the good cheer began to fray. "Where is Max?" Olivia asked, tearing corn husks like it was a new game. Her brother said nothing, but a dark cloud came over his face. "Yeah, where is that mutt? I haven't seen him all morning," Ed noted. Abuela merely shrugged. Liam gritted his teeth. He didn't want to say. There would be no understanding or belief from anyone but his sister. Even then, it would just be tears. Then he would be blamed for upsetting her. But it wasn't his fault. The tree was infested by a predatory invader. "I know what happened to Max." Liam spoke with loss leaking from every word. Everyone turned to him. "You won't believe me, but I saw it last night. The thing in the tree got him." The tears he had been fighting back began to loosen and fall. Ed let out a deep sigh. "Son, come on, boy. There is nothing wrong with that tree." "What does got him mean?" inquired Olivia. "It's not the tree. There is a monster living in the tree. It's some kind of furry snakeapede. It ate Max, Dad. I saw it do it." Liam couldn't help raising his voice to a quivering shout before he broke down in tears. All the anger drained from Ed as he saw his son weeping in front of him. "Max is eaten? Like, gone?" Olivia's tiny voice began to quake with sorrow as well. Ed put his hands up to try and dam up the river of tears. Guys, Max didn't get eaten by a tree monster." "Then where is he?" Liam slammed his bald fist on the table. "Yeah," added Olivia. Ed hated it when they ganged up on him like this. He looked to Abuela, but she only shook her head back at him. "I don't know. Did one of you leave the back door open last night? You know he can push open the screen door. Maybe he's just prowling around the neighborhood looking for lady dogs." He could tell from their eyes that neither of them bought it. He didn't even really buy it. Ed always checked the doors before bed. He wondered if he had been too drunk after work last night and let the dog out but forgot to let him back in. It was possible, but he didn't recall seeing the dog at all when he got in. The whole thing sat uneasily within him. "Go look at the spot in front of the tree, Dad. You can still see flecks of blood. There should be a lot more, but I don't know, it drank it up or something." Ed frowned. "Okay, I will check, if it will make y'all feel any better." Ed stepped up and stalked out into the living room. Liam and Olivia followed. Abuela continued to sip her coffee and hummed along to a song played only in her head. Liam pointed to the spot that had been the scene of the attack. Ed hunkered down and looked at the area. He touched it with his index fingers and wiped it along the wood. When he pulled it back, there was undeniably a coating of dark brown. A chill of fear ran through Ed. He looked at his children with a new sense of worry. While he still didn't think there was a snakeapede or whatever his son had said, the idea of a very human monster having done this seemed terrifyingly plausible. He knew from experience the house wasn't as secure as he would like. The window locks were pathetic, and the door locks could be picked. They had no electronic security system. Some sicko could have broken in. Hell, they could still be here. Ed's dark complexion blanched. "I want you kids to spend the day with Abuela. Don't leave her side." "Is Max okay?" Olivia squeaked. I'm not sure, baby, but I want to make sure you two are. Watch movies, play games, but do it with her. If anything is weird, or you see anyone you don't know, call me at work immediately. You're working tonight? Liam asked with a frown. Got to. Jeff called out. But I'll be home for presents in the morning. He tried to put on a plastic smile. The mention of presents seemed to brighten up Olivia's disposition. Can we play Monopoly? She chirped. Of course, just make sure it's with Abuela. Olivia cheered and ran to get the game from the closet. Ed knelt down in order to meet his son eye to eye. I believe you. Maybe it isn't the monster you think it is, but something is wrong. If you need to, call me. Call the police. I believe in you. I trust you. He hugged his son tightly. But... Liam tried to interject. No buts. I'll be gone in an hour, and then you'll be in charge. He leaned in and whispered into his son's ear. If anybody tries to hurt you or your sister, get the axe. It's in the garage by the gas cans. With that, Ed stood up and left to shower before work. Worry was heavy in his heart, but they needed the money. Most of Christmas had been bought on credit, and there was no way he could turn down holiday pay and tips. When Liam caught up with his sister, she was already in the kitchen, with the family's ancient copy of Monopoly. Olivia was carefully taking off the rubber bands that held the dilapidated cardboard box together. She loved Monopoly, despite the fact the game almost always ended with her in tears and Abuela with a fat stack of colorful bills. Regardless, Olivia always picked it. This was how their day burned away, with the three of them in front of the faded board, rolling dice, groaning, and cheering. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the game was finally over, after 5 grueling hours. Abuela had inexorably built her Monopoly on the backs of her grandchildren's tears. No fair, Olivia cried. Abuela agreed, but shrugged her shoulders. Life isn't fair, Liam said as he began to pack in the game. Abuela nodded her assent at the comment, before telling the children to go and watch television, while she made pozole for dinner. Olivia sulked off to watch Christmas cartoons, while her brother finished sliding the game and its sundry pieces back into the crushed container, carefully putting the rubber bands back around as to not snap himself with them. Love you, Abuela, he said, carrying the game back to its home in the cupboard. Yo también te quiero, she croaked back as she began to pull out the pork from the fridge. Liam found his sister in front of the Grinch for the umpteenth time. Already she had completely forgotten about the game. Her brother shook his head and smiled. As he walked back from storing the game, he eyed the Christmas tree. It seemed so innocuous, so innocent, just ornaments and shining lights. But he knew different. He wondered if he should go get the axe, just to be safe. But he thought better of it, since it would definitely freak his sister out. Instead, he merely took a vigil and used his sentinel eyes to keep a close watch on the shimmering tree. It didn't take long for the lack of sleep from the night before to mix with the false security of the television, to lure him into a fitful slumber. He relived the horror of last night in his mind. Only in his dream, Max asked for help with Olivia's voice. Before he knew it, Abuela was shaking him awake for dinner. The television was off, and Olivia was already in the kitchen with a big bowl of lush stew. He yawned and told her he would be right there. As he went to the table, he saw from the window that the house was being assaulted with thick drifts of snow, the kind that made the best snowballs and angels. But even still, his heart was heavy. He wondered how long it had been going on like this. Then he thought of his dad and worried. He prayed that he would be able to make it back. It was a night terribly similar to this one, 3 years ago now, that his mother hadn't come home. Instead, they received a phone call. Liam pushed the memory to the corner it always sat in, then got his own bowl of the intoxicating smelling stew. The three ate happily before she sent them off to bed. She warned they better not be up for Papa Noel. Otherwise, they would get nothing but coal. Olivia took the warning very seriously. Liam smiled and herded his sister upstairs. It's the final night. I can't wait for tomorrow. Do you think Papa Noel will bring Max with him? Olivia asked. Liam's insides crumpled at the question. Maybe. Now let's go get our last present before tomorrow. The boy had argued with himself while he laid in bed. A piece of his mind was with the axe in the garage. Even if he could hardly swing it, something was a lot better than nothing. He felt certain that his baseball bat fell squarely into the nothing category as surely as his bony fists. The nightmare in his Christmas tree would not be felled by anything so scrawny. Instead of presents, the only visions dancing in his head were those of death. He imagined the creature loping up the stairs to their lockless bedroom. In his mind, he cut its head off with the axe. Eventually, while imagining the battle between man and monster, he fell asleep. It was just after 5 a.m. when he was awakened by an ear-piercing scream. Liam shot up in bed and felt for the axe that was in his dream before he remembered he had never gotten it. He turned to see Olivia had heard it too. She was awake and gripping a stuffed unicorn for all its stuffing. With a grunt, he flipped the covers off and slipped his feet onto the freezing floor. The floor was even colder than normal. So was the air in their room against his bare skin. He looked out the window to see the blizzard had not abated. It was coming down in furious sheets, just like it had been when they went to bed. Was that Papa Noel? Do you think he fell off the roof? Olivia asked sincerely. No, it wasn't. I need you to stay up here and hide. Got it? He told her with authority he didn't feel. But, she protested, no buts. This is monster business, and you would just be a snack. An idea struck him like a brick. Actually, go into Abuela's room and call the police on her phone. Tell them about the monster? No, tell them about a burglar and that we need help. But we don't have a burglar. We have a monster. Olivia, please, just listen to me. I'll go wake Dad. If this was serious enough to wake their father, she knew not to argue. Liam dashed to their dad's room only to find it empty. A scowl spread on the boy's face. He hoped he merely got stuck at work. It wouldn't be the first time a blizzard had stranded him at the bar. Wasting no more time, Liam scurried down the stairs as fast as he could to help in any way he could, even if that was in no way at all. When he got to the bottom of the steps, he gasped at the terrible scene in front of him. The multi-legged, green-furred, segmented monstrosity was once again out of its hiding spot, but instead of killing his dog, now it was trying to wrap itself around his abuela. Liam ran as fast as he could toward the door that connected to the garage, scolding himself every step of the way for not getting their only real weapon when he had the chance. Presents lay strewn around her body as her raised arms tried to fight off the scuttling beast. It hissed and snapped its jaws wildly at the old woman. She had been laying out the children's presents when she heard the clicking. Before she could even investigate, its fibrous body burst forth from its hidden confines. The beast reeked of blood and soil. The large, flat head sprung once more at her own wrinkled face. With luck and difficulty, she managed to catch it by the pincers. She had caught the bull by the horns, but those razored teeth were beginning to cut deeply into her shaking, gnarled fingers. Blood slicked the tusks and excited the beast even further. Its multitude of eyes stared at her with deadly intent. Her wide brown eyes, full of fear, looked into its massive gullet filled with endless needle teeth. Shunk! A glistening muscular appendage shot out from inside of its cavernous maw. It was a bony spear with a curved spike like a fishing hook on the end. It had harpooned the elderly woman's withered forearm. She howled in pain as she could feel a powerful sucking sensation beginning to pull from the terrible tongue. Then the muscular tether began to wind back up, drawing the woman's hand into the beast's hungry jaws. She screamed in agony as the creature crunched down on her hand, the thousands of tiny teeth stripping the flesh away from her bones in only a few mere moments. Tears streamed down the old woman's face as she prayed for deliverance from this demon. It was at this moment that Liam came running into the room. He held the old axe high and yelled with all the ferocity his body could muster. Then he brought down the axe with more force and power than he had ever summoned in his short life, directly down onto the beast's head. All of its shiny black eyes looked around wildly in pain, trying to find the source of this new threat. Liam pulled on the axe's handle to try and raise it for another strike. But like the tree before it, he had wedged it too deeply for his arms to pull it out again. He yanked and heaved on the handle, but it wouldn't be removed from the monster's stony carapace. Instead, all of its eyes found its new foe. With lightning speed, the creature corked up its long, muscular body, then unleashed a massive whipping slice directly into Liam's chest. The blow hurt unlike anything the boy had experienced in his life. It was like the time Hunter Weinberger punched him in the solar plexus for not giving him his chocolate milk, only it felt 1,000 times more painful. And the hit was accompanied by an audible crack. Liam wasn't sure if it was just the sound of the chitin smacking against skin or if it had broken a few ribs. Either way, Liam was thrown backward into the Christmas tree. The branches broke his fall, but the wooden spikes also left their own cuts and bruises, along with the crack and shatter of the ancient Christmas lights, followed by the sizzle and pop of electricity as the circuit was broken and the filaments exploded, causing tiny sparks. Those tiny sparks caught to the sap of the pine and became fire quicker than Liam could fall to the ground from the all-powerful slap. Another scream cut through the air, this one much higher pitched. "Olivia," Liam tried to speak, but he found his chest breathless. Liam tried to lift his aching body to survey the chaos before him. The first thing he saw was his abuela, her arm almost to the shoulder joint inside of the creature's mouth. Blood dripping down the creature's hideous face. Then beyond that was his little sister screaming, hugging the stuffed unicorn like it was a talisman against the torments in front of her. The cordless phone dropped around her feet, a metallic voice squawking into the void. It was then he became aware of the heat exploding out behind him. As he staggered to his feet, he saw the tree engulfed in flames. Breathing hurt, his whole body ached. In spite of his pain, he refused to not at least try to save his abuela. Acting more on instinct than reason, he grabbed one of the branches that was not fully inflamed yet and pulled it forward. He fell backward and out of the falling tree's trajectory. However, the flaming timber landed squarely on the many-legged, bloodthirsty home invader. Another instant later, and the flame to jump from the tree onto the creature's furry body. The pine-like bristles seemed to take to the fire as well as the genuine article. It began to writhe and squirm in agony. Liam dragged his body over to his abuela. Her arm was still caught in the flailing fiend's clutches, but when it opened its maw to emit a blood-curdling, otherworldly scream, Liam pulled his abuela back from the flaming abomination. Her bloody and mangled arm slid out of the creature's screaming gullet. In places it was chewed down to the bone and looked like it had been ravaged by a school of starving piranha. Abuela's eyes were shut, but she was murmuring something and still breathing softly. Liam could only imagine what kind of pain she must be in. He put her good arm around his shoulder and tried to lift her, but she was too heavy. The screaming nightmare in their living room began to whip around, scurrying all along the house and igniting everything it crashed into. It was desperately trying to find an escape, but it only found walls and furniture. Liam wanted to cry. The smoke was getting worse as the flames spread. It was all happening so fast. All he knew is that they needed to get outside now. He heaved up again. At first he couldn't lift her, but then he felt her getting lighter. He looked over and saw Olivia. She was wrenching up with all of her heart around Abuela's middle. Somehow it was just enough for them to get the old woman to her feet. The trio then staggered their way to the front door. With a grunt, Liam flipped the lock and twisted the knob. The door swung open and the three fell forward into the piles of snow that had completely engulfed their tiny cement porch. Olivia shut the door behind them urgently. She hadn't forgotten about the monster. The little girl would never forget about it. They could still hear the creature inside wailing in its dying light. It was a haunting sound, but one that Liam was only too happy to hear. The three sat huddled together in the snow for warmth. They hadn't been able to get jackets. The only heat they had to share was the fire consuming their home. But they were all still alive. 20 minutes or so after they had escaped, red and blue lights glowed in their driveway, followed by the massive truck from the fire department. An ambulance was called for Abuela. The police asked what had happened. Olivia started talking about the creature. Liam put his hand on her shoulder. There was a burglar, and then he set a fire. The tree went up. The officer wrote it down and nodded. That was sufficient explanation after all. Liam knew perfectly well adults would never believe what actually had happened that awful Christmas morning. It was not long after their father returned home in his pickup. He practically jumped from his seat and flew to the kids. Panic painted on his features, he scooped up his children and hugged them tightly until Liam winced and he set them both down. I saw the smoke when I was coming home. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, he said with tears in his eyes. They all just hugged as the snow fell. I was brave, Dad. We killed it. Ed looked confused, but just nodded and smiled. He honestly didn't care. He was just so happy his babies were okay. The paramedics finished strapping down Abuela for the hospital. The firefighters tried in vain to put the house out, but it blazed until the tiny structure was charred and dead. Ed prayed the insurance would cover it. After he talked with the police, he corralled the kids to get into the truck so they could meet Abuela at the hospital. Liam nodded and pulled the blanket they had given them around him tighter. He walked up to his decimated home one last time to say goodbye. Sounded from somewhere in the ruins. The end. I hope everyone who listened enjoyed this story, and I hope you all have a very happy holiday. Stay safe and stay spooky. Until next week.